At one time, the Texas coast had over 6.5 million acres of coastal prairie. Today, less than 0.1% of that native prairie remains. Over decades of development, we've cut back our natural habitat that not only supports native wildlife and vegetation, but that would have helped mitigate flooding, fight subsidence, and cool the region. Local environmentalists and activists, though, have been working hard over the past decades to revitalize this habitat and to reconnect Houstonians to our historic ecosystems. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in Rice University's Environmental Studies program and the program manager of the Diluvial Houston Initiative, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. Today on Gulf Streams, we're talking about prairie projects, why pocket prairies are popping up around town, and how they might help us to rethink our more familiar landscapes like lawns. We're joined by two experts this hour, Professor Maggie Tsang, a landscape architect at Rice University, and, later in the hour, Jaime Gonzalez of the Nature Conservancy. Maggie Tsang, thank you so much for joining us. Just to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about your practice? And I know you're a landscape architect, but especially as we think about, the environment, landscape architects clearly, shape our environment in many ways, but I know that you think more deeply about it than that. So can you just walk us through a little bit about your own practice and how you think about these kind of broader questions?
Yes, thank you so much for having me on the show today. My name is Maggie, obviously, and I'm a landscape designer, but I also kind of occupy many different positions because I'm originally trained as an architect, but I would also work in urban environments and in urban design. And so landscape architecture is actually a very small profession. It's maybe not well understood by lots of people because it is a very small group of professionals. But we do think about the built and natural environment, thinking through living systems, maybe different from architects who work on building systems and built environments. Landscape architects are really thinking about a whole range of things, from plant life and plant biology, all the way up to kind of the scales of infrastructure and kind of large network systems of hydrology and ecology and regional networks. So it's a really exciting profession because we're able to span many different scales of inquiry. Myself, I have a small practice of landscape architecture and urban design, which is based in Houston, and it's called Department. We're an office of 6 people, and we work at all of those different scales. So we're working on sort of typical design projects that might look like a garden, a residential garden, or maybe a kind of commercial landscape, and also working on larger public parks at the scale of the Bayou, for example. So,
oh wow, okay.
I think that's one of the most exciting parts of the design practice is that you're able to kind of to translate some principles and ideas across many different scales. And at the same time, because I'm also an assistant professor at the School of Architecture, I'm also able to engage in research. So that's also a really important part of our practice is that we're kind of always mediating between design practice and building things and making things happen in the world, but also reflecting on them in sort of a broader context in a research and academic environment. So through design studios at the School of Architecture and through my own scholarly research, collaborating with the civil engineering department or the sociology department, and also through some experimental installations, which we'll talk about, we're able to kind of zoom out a little bit from a kind of day-to-day design practice and think about kind of how these sort of design problems plug into kind of broader questions of ecology and landscape and the climate crisis, obviously.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I mean, I think probably for most of us, when we think of landscape architecture, we're not immediately running over to civil engineers and sociologists. So, I mean, that really helps understand just how broadly you're thinking through the role that landscape really plays in myriad issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the landscape design and landscape architecture, because it's such a specific and interesting profession, because unlike architecture, which has a very kind of storied and specific kind of path that leads to kind of an architect and training. Landscape architects come from so many different backgrounds. You can come to landscape architecture as an architect. You can also come to landscape architecture as a biologist or a geologist, for example, or as an artist or an English major. So there's so many different pathways that people who care about the environment, who are thinking through how do I make a difference in the environment, can find themselves in landscape architecture.
I have a hunch by the end of this episode, we're going to all have a little moment of we should all be landscape
Yes,
architects.
and that's part of my agenda.
So shifting gears a little bit, I know you've had a recent project where you reworked a large lawn space on campus into essentially a prairie garden. And we're really curious as to what inspired you to create these prairie plots installation at Rice University.
Yeah, thanks for that question. The installation is right next to the James Turrell Sky Space, which is a very prominent kind of public artwork on Rice campus.
And on Instagram.
Yes,
so
and
if you
on
know
Instagram.
Houston, you probably know the Sky Space.
Absolutely. And so the Prairie Plots is just right next to that. And prior to installing it, we were really thinking about Houston's ecology, Houston's kind of endemic ecosystems. And as landscape designers, we're always interested in practice in some way and how do we actually engage the ground and how do we work with the ground and work with the environment. So, the idea really came about looking at so many of the different vast lawn spaces that exist not only on campus, but also at the city at large. And so we were using the campus almost as a living laboratory to re-envision what some of these large-scale lawn spaces could really be if they were thinking about kind of biodiversity, thinking about how they give back to the environment, how they create kind of healthy ecosystems. And so the project kind of started as a small research project that has kind of kept going, I would say, and has engaged the university in many different ways. It's about 10,000 square feet of previously just turf lawn. And we worked closely not only through the School of Architecture, but with Rice's Facilities Engineering and Planning Department through the grounds. Through grounds, and we worked closely with them to replace that roughly 10,000 square feet with this prairie garden. And we call it prairie plots because it consists of multiple 20 by 20 foot plots where we removed the turf material and planted different species of prairie plants. And part of our goal with the project was to really see how much life we could bring back to this kind of monoculture or this very homogeneous lawn space.
What do you mean by monoculture? Can you define that for us?
Yeah, monoculture, is just the kind of uniformity or homogeneousness or self-similarity of species. So in turf grasses and a lot of these lawn spaces, you find only a few
St. Augustine grass everywhere.
St. Augustine, as well as Bermuda grass, is a very typical kind of turf grasses. And in this space, what we wanted to explore was the kind of native grasslands and ecosystems of the Houston area. And so we were looking to kind of tall grass prairie, which is a native ecosystem of the Houston region, which used to be this kind of vast Gulf Coast prairie, right? This entire region now totally taken over by the metropolis that is Houston. We can think back at and look at kind of historical imagery and think through and re-envision what these kind of prairie ecosystems looked like. So we really wanted to think, how do we kind of re-envision a lawn space that is actually performing more like a tallgrass prairie. And the tallgrass prairie, because of its extensive root systems, is capable of absorbing a lot more water into the soil. It can improve soil health, and it can also, through a kind of diversity of plant material, bring back biodiversity to these kind of more homogeneous lawn spaces. So it was our intention to bring multiple species back to the lawn, but also to create a kind of habitat. So for not only for birds and other sorts of more visible creatures, but also insects. And that's also a really important part of kind of bringing biodiversity back to the campus.
I'm so glad you mentioned this because it's just I walk by the prairie plot, pretty frequently on campus, as I think many folks on campus do. But, I walked through it several times. And I remember at one point in the spring just walking through and seeing hundreds of dragonflies just buzzing around. And it was both, visceral that I'm like, nowhere else on campus do I experience this level of, oh, there's just life around me. But also that it changed the way that I heard campus, not just the way that I saw campus or kind of experienced it from walking, but just hearing that buzzing of life was actually a really fascinating kind of experience to have. And it brings me to this, I think a broader question about, I think there's a number of goals that you have. You've already articulated some of the more scientific and really, kind of healthy, healthy environment goals of this project, but you're also a landscape architect. I know you're also thinking about beauty and color and the way that our landscape impacts us in myriad ways. And so can you talk about, what is unique to this project and the ways that you're thinking about it that goes beyond, I'm sure if we wanted to, we could just replace a lot of tall grass with other kinds of tall grass and be like, great, but you're doing something that I think is more nuanced with that attention to different species, with the way that you've organized the plot. So maybe you can walk us through, for those who have not been fortunate enough to experience the plot yet, some of those goals and some of how you've arranged it.
Yeah, that's a great question, and really gets to the kind of cultural part of the project and the visual part of the project. And our siting of the prairie plots next to the Terrell Sky Space was not was a intentional decision because it's a really highly trafficked space on campus. Yeah. So people see it a lot. People, when they go to see the Sky Space, they also see the prairie plots. And so it's a way to also engage the public in a larger conversation about the kind of visual culture of landscape. And so I think that there's a kind of assumption that, and this gets to the question of the lawn as well, the assumption that the kind of flat, green, homogeneous, never-ending lawn is a kind of cultural ideal, especially in a kind of American context, especially in a kind of suburban American context. And I think we really want to kind of question that through this project and to think through biodiversity as a cultural ideal as well. And so the project is, I think, important because it is living. And so people, as they pass through it multiple times in different seasons, will see it in a very different way. And we've gotten a lot of questions like, oh, in the winter, someone has emailed me and said, your garden is dead. Which I think is hilarious and also really important to say, like, no, it's not dead. It's winter. It's dormant. And to sort of engage a public in seasonal change and the idea that landscapes are not fixed, that environments are not fixed, that they're always evolving and kind of part of a set of very dynamic systems and part of seasonal change. And to be able to tune into that and to be able to, call upon people to think through careful observation of the landscape as a way of engaging it. So definitely the prairie plots, if you see it in December or you see it in the spring or you see it in the hot heat of the summer, it's going to look radically different. And I think that's part of the importance of kind of the durational aspect of the prairie plots is that you see it in many different stages and you just start to see and connect these time-based changes through the project. And I think the other way in which it is engaging a public is through kind of the maintenance and upkeep of the prairie plots. It's not a neglected landscape. We do leave it be in a lot of ways, and we don't mow it as constantly as many of the other campus lawns are mowed. And so that is one of the important parts of the project, is reducing the kind of greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with regularly mowing lawns, and also reducing irrigation that is associated with vast turf lawns. But at the same time, it is maintained. We do regularly go in and assist with kind of removing some of the more invasive species to give the prairie plants more ability to be established and to survive. And we also engage a community of volunteers as well as student groups to partake in these maintenance events or these maintenance volunteer days. So, we have a website in which we're engaging folks to on these volunteer days, which they might be tasked with multiple different things, from pulling weeds to covering paths with mulch to adding compost to collecting seed. So in that way, there's also a kind of important part of the project, which is about calling attention to the maintenance of our landscapes. And people think of maintenance as this kind of maybe with a slightly more negative connotation. People don't want to maintain things, or having high maintenance landscapes is really challenging and difficult. But I think what we really want to push against that idea that maintenance is also care, and maintenance is also a way of cultivating and caring about a space. So, sometimes these prairie landscapes might require some amount of maintenance, and that is a way of engaging humans with their environment, right? It's not about mowing and blowing or applying chemicals and irrigating and these kind of like laborious tasks, but actually rethinking how we maintain and take care of landscapes as a kind of inherent and a really important act that we do.
Well, and I think something that's exciting probably to a lot of listeners is, yes, you're talking about the maintenance of the site, but also this sounds like a lot less maintenance than a lot of those monoculture, kind of projects where exactly we are mowing less. I'm really curious about, you mentioned less irrigation and why that might be, if you want to talk a little about that.
Yeah, I think that with turf grasses, there's a lot of technicalities around it, but with turf grasses, we irrigate them constantly, and we also mow them constantly to keep their root systems really, really short. So to keep this kind of maintained, manicured lawn requires quite a lot of irrigation and quite a lot of mowing. And so with tall grass prairies, there's not that level of upkeep. It's actually maybe once a year you would kind of cut down the dormant material.
Wow.
So it's a really different type of time scale and really different type of way of engaging a space. And so we're not irrigating these plants because they are endemic to this region and they're used to the kind of wet, dry fluctuations of the Houston climate. So by using plant species that are endemic or adapted to the region, we're able to kind of reduce the amount of inputs that we have on the landscape.
No, I think for a lot of listeners, the idea that they would only have to mow once a year suddenly is a radically different idea of like what this maintenance you're talking about looks like compared to most of us, are out once every other week or so.
Right, exactly. And then the benefits are amazing, right? Like you have much more biodiversity. You're able to create habitat. You're able to create a healthier landscape that's not pouring toxic chemicals into the ground, right? Or wasting water or using racking up your water bill for irrigation. So I think that in our work, we're really trying to emphasize that ecosystem health, environmental health is also human health. So they're not exclusive of one another. To say that like if we're irrigating less and we're not using as many pesticides or insecticides and we're not mowing with a lot of noxious greenhouse gases, that's beneficial to us as humans, but also beneficial to the environment in terms of fostering biodiversity and creating healthy landscapes.
I know Sienna has some questions about community and ways to bring this outside into different places. Before I let her jump into that, I do want to ask one other question purely for me because it was exciting to the little boy in my heart that I think you did a controlled burn at one point on campus because you've been talking about mowing, but I think at one time there was actual fire involved, which is very exciting.
Yes, we did do. I think it was last spring, around the end of February and early March, we worked with the City of Houston Fire Department, as well as with folks at Rice Campus, with the grounds crew and the crisis management team as well, to conduct a controlled burn at prairie plots. And this is a very small burn compared to, you think of vast prairie systems, vast forested areas that have also controlled burns. And so it was actually a really interesting experiment. Fire ecology is really important. For controlled fire can be really important to kind of continuing and benefiting the kind of prairie ecosystem. And so as humans, because we've urbanized and changed the landscape so much, we do these controlled burns as a way of maintaining these spaces, encouraging continued growth of the grassland. And so for many folks, it's very normal. But I think in the context of university campus, it can be a little bit daunting. The idea of fire in the campus is not exactly an encouraging one. So it was a learning experience for everyone to talk about fire as something that's not inherently a negative thing, but actually has a benefit at the level of control and management that we prescribed for the fire. So it was a small kind of smoldering, almost like small campfire, but it helped to manage some of the invasive species. It helped to encourage growth for the next season. So it was both there was both an ecological goal behind it, but at the same time, there was also a cultural social part of it where we're engaging this broader campus and this conversation around fire ecologies and around prescribed fires in more urban settings.
And not at all just exciting random bygoers who,
Exactly.
passerbys like me who are just like, I'm going to sit and watch the fire now.
It was also a great sight.
So, kind of shifting our focus to broader communities, how can communities move away from this traditional turf grass and towards more sustainable landscaping practices, such as using more native plants in their landscapes and really just moving away from the typical American lawn?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that cultivating biodiversity is what maybe a big thing that I want to emphasize.
Just so we have it. We've defined it before on the show, and I think a lot of listeners are probably familiar, but just since you've mentioned it a couple times, can you give us a quick definition of biodiversity?
Yeah, a very simple way of thinking about biodiversity is just having more than one type of thing in a space, right? So in turf grasses, we have maybe just one or two types of turf grasses that are there, so that are planted. And so biodiversity means introducing additional species, and especially endemic species that are adapted to the climate of this region is really important. And I avoid the word native a little bit because there are a lot of things that can perform really well in the climate of Houston or in whatever climate people might be in that are not necessarily native to a particular region. And also as the climate changes, we have to be able to expand our definition of what native means, right? So I use the word endemic or adapted to be able to talk about species that are appropriate to a given place, a given set of conditions, in a given climate. So maybe that was getting away from the biodiversity question a little bit.
I think that's a really good point, though, because I think there is, I agree, folks tend to really hone in on native, and we do have certain attachments to that viewpoint. And exactly, as things are changing, recognizing what are beneficial, that are the kind of the new natives, I think becomes critical. So I love this terminology you're giving us to talk around that.
Yeah, so for moving away from the kind of typical lawn is thinking about introducing additional species, thinking about not just this kind of homogeneous green flat thing, right? But about how you can cultivate habitat, and it might just be about introducing one or two new plants to your median or to your lawn, and thinking of it more as a planted area that can support wildlife or pollinators, for example. And like I said before, I think it all has a kind of benefit for us also. We were reducing our water bills, reducing the amount of inputs that we're bringing to our gardens. So I think that can be a really important way of kind of substituting our typical American lawn with planting areas that might host multiple types of butterflies and beautiful flowers and taller grasses, and also require us to kind of not input as many chemicals and resources into the land.
And I was just wondering, so you have this installation by the Sky Space, but would you in the future ever be able to do any other types of prairie plot installations around Rice or just in general around Houston?
Yeah, I think it's a kind of call to everybody to do that. I think that's what the Prairie Plots is intending to do, is to kind of create a starting point and something that the public can engage in, and then take it back to their own homes or to other spaces that they might have. So, in schoolyards or in public right of ways or in backyards and things like that. Like, I think there's a lot of potential, and there's so much latent landscape space that's just covered by turf grass or neglected in some way, that can really benefit from a community of people with shared ideals to expand on the principles of prairie plots. And prairie plots is by far not the only example of this. It's just one that happens to be on Rice campus. So I think there's also a community of people who are actively doing this right now, who are thinking about how do we cultivate more biodiversity and less maintenance or fewer inputs in our local gardens or community gardens or in my own backyard. And I think there's definitely a lot of potential there.
Well, and to that point, I know something that listeners have been really interested in the past and keen to learn more about is, specific, and I don't need you to go through a whole list here, but, specific plants they could put that might be really beneficial or that do really well in Houston, things to point them to. And I'm curious, since you've come to you've come through this whole project, do you have any favorite plants you love to see in a garden? Or
Well, that's a great question. I think that at Prairie Plots, we only intentionally planted a handful of coastal prairie plants. So that and one of my favorites at Prairie Plots is called the Texas coneflower, and it's one that's extremely localized to this region. You can't find it in a lot of other places. But the Rudbeckia in general, that kind of family of plants, is an amazing prairie plant, and they have these beautiful, huge yellow flowers. And they can be, sometimes people think of these plants as like small and diminutive.
I have some small purple coneflower on my patio that are not the same thing.
Yeah, but they're all related in
Yes.
a lot of ways. And so this particular coneflower is at Prairie Plots can be around like 6 feet tall.
Wow.
And so it's an incredible plant. Maybe that's not one for the front yard or the backyard. So I would add that I think that for your own front yard or backyard or residential landscape, I think that the liatris or even the little blue stem grass plant is a great one and widely accessible at nurseries. So it's easy to find and easy to plant, and it's a very beautiful alternative to kind of your turf grass.
Well, this has been fantastic talking with you, Professor Tsang. We're so grateful for your time and your expertise and this really exciting project on Rice's campus that's moving out beyond. And so I just want to thank you again for sharing your expertise with us today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
So we're thrilled to be speaking with you again, Jaime Gonzalez. Can you just introduce yourselves for listeners and tell us a little bit about your work at the Nature Conservancy and what you're up to?
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. My name is Jaime Gonzalez, and I'm the Community and Equitable Conservation Director for the Nature Conservancy in Texas. For the first 5 years of my role, I've been here 6 years, I was the Houston Healthy Cities Director. So a lot of my work has really been about working with community members, the city, the county, other nonprofits for climate resiliency, human health, and biodiversity, using the power of nature and restoring nature into landscapes that are in desperate need of it. So now I'm also working on how does equity get infused into the conservation movement, particularly with our chapter, but also with our partners. And also, how can we work with environmental justice groups? The conservation movement and environmental justice movements have not been well connected. But this topic that we're going to talk about today, mowing and its impacts on human health and air quality, is a perfect place where we can synergize between conservation and environmental justice.
Great, thank you. And so just to start us off, can you give us a little bit, I know because you've done so much work around prairies in particular, and we're thinking around prairies and lawns today. What is the historic role of prairies? Like I know a large amount of the naturescape around us was prairies, but can you talk us through what does this place actually look like, and what were prairies doing, and why are we so invested in them still?
Yeah, like why care about prairies? They could seem very antiquated, right? The truth is, prairies are like all ecosystems. They're very multidimensional. Here in the Houston area, it was the predominant landscape. You couldn't go anywhere without seeing some form of prairie, unless you were north of the city where the piney woods really kicked off. But, everywhere from, Tomball and Spring down, you would have had some form of prairie. And when you got to places like Rice University, the medical center, the Galleria, historically, for thousands of years, it was home to an extraordinarily diverse grassland called the coastal prairie. And it could just be, you could just look at it from a kind of a biodiversity, biological standpoint, ecological standpoint. But that would really miss so many of the stories about why it's important. I talk a lot about culturally meaningful landscapes. And when you look at Texas, you look at Houston, you look at the rodeo, this is the landscape that produced that, classic Texas cowboy, cowgirl iconography, our foodways with barbecue, our music ways with the blues and country and western swing. It's where people go to take pictures of the bluebonnets. There's so many cultural references, so many sports teams that are named with prairie references, like the Cowboys and the Texans and the Spurs and the Mavericks. It goes on and on and on. And then I think, for me, having a place that makes sense, that has a cultural underpinning in the ecology is really important. But at this time, we also have climate change. We have huge amounts of nature disparities or health disparities here in Greater Houston, and this extremely ancient landscape can help us meet those very modern challenges. So I think it's a landscape that is coming full circle. There's a prairie renaissance happening here in the Greater Houston area, a lot of groups working together. And it's been recognized by the city and the county as being important for resilience and for public health and for incorporation into public spaces. So I'm excited about where this is going and what we can do to even further this to create a kind of more meaningful, healthy, and verdant and wild place.
Well, and I know that's something that, you've been, leading a lot of these projects, and some of those are pocket prairies. I'm sure there's other things you're doing as well. But can you talk us through a little bit, what are some of these projects you're mentioning that are, prairies that are springing up in unexpected places that you've had a hand in putting together?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to recognize that the strength of the prairie movement is that it's a movement. There are so many groups working on this. But back in 2009, we held a conference down at Armand Bayou Nature Center. And we recognized that very few folks in the general public knew what a prairie was, knew where to go to see a prairie, knew what the value was, or anything like that. And so at this conference, we decided to work together more closely to advance conservation and science and all the things you need for prairie conservation. But we also decided to create a constellation of pocket prairies throughout Houston to put them in highly visible spaces. And the first one that we decided on was called the Whistle Stop Prairie in Herman Park. Prairie had been gone from the park for decades. Yeah. And so we worked with the Herman Park Conservancy. We put in that first pocket prairie. And then a movement was kind of born. And there are pocket prairies and larger urban prairies all over the city now, in the Texas Medical Center, Memorial Park, Buffalo Bayou Park, on corporate campuses, and on schoolyards. And so I've worked on a lot of schoolyard pocket prairies, and now we're working on a really large restoration of 4.5 acres on a preschool campus in Alief, which I'm very excited about.
So I was just wondering, what are the ecological benefits of these prairies? Why are we choosing these small-scale or residential prairies over traditional lawns, per se?
Yeah. I think when you look at lawns, as we know, you just have to do the deep dive. Like, why were lawns created in the first place? What messages were we trying to send? What was the aesthetic?
Give us that deep dive really quick, or maybe the quick version of maybe the 6-foot deep dive.
Yeah, and there's a historic process here, which is really kind of an interesting wrinkle. I think that we inherited this aesthetic from Europe, and mostly from Europeans that were of great means, right? Because it was a status symbol. Those folks who could maintain a lawn, that was a status symbol because not everybody could do that. And what's interesting is we got a lot of our cultural cues from the English, and as we know, if you look at English lawns, they're often bordered by meadows, very colorful, very vibrant, flower-rich meadows. But it seems like we just took the lawn part and we forgot all the wildflowers. And so I think it's one of these things that got translated to the U.S. and it's really being incorporated into the visual representation of the quote-unquote American dream. Have that picket fence, have that lawn, no matter if you're living in a place with lots of water or water scarcity, So you'll go to these desert cities and you see these green, lush lawns on golf courses and residential areas when, that's obviously not the best use of resources. And so we translated it here, and it, we just didn't really think about it too much. But now that we are in the midst of the climate crisis, now that we're in the midst of these great health disparities that we're looking at, continued chronic air pollution issues, the need to make the city spongier to absorb more water, I think that we have choices to make in terms of how we manage nature. And the choices that we make will impact people, their health, the resilience of the city. So, those lawns were really built for a different century, not the century we're made to face right now. And so it's a great time to really think about, what kind of spaces do we want to have?
I think that's something that I've heard you speak of before, and I know you're very invested in the connection between the environment that we're living in and our health. And it's something that we don't often think about as like the way that a lawn might actually impact our health.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you can speak to that some, because it's really, I've heard you speak on it before. You've talked a little on the program about it before, but just that there's actually, health consequences to the way that we're handling even something as simple as our front and back lawns, which we would not normally think of as having a lot of bearing on our immediate, how healthy my kids might be, right?
No, absolutely. A lot of my work is really centered on the One Health construct, which means that the health of the people, the health of the wildlife and animals, and the health of the environment itself in terms of air, soil, and water quality are all super linked. So whenever you make land use choices, there are no neutral choices. They're either going to be fairly beneficial for the people, the wildlife. Could be that there's a difference between the two, but a lot of times they go in lockstep because we are biological creatures ourselves with lungs and environmental needs for keeping the place cooler and not getting flooded and things like that. And so in terms of the health impacts of lawns, there was a recent study that came out that was put out by Environment Texas along with a couple of other groups, and it was extremely revealing. It came out last October, and it's going to read you a couple of statistics that kind of will blow your mind.
Yeah.
So a 2020 data set from US EPA revealed that Harris County, through its mowing and through this highly manicured, managed set of landscapes, everything from your yard to parks to houses of worship, accounts for 358 tons of particulate matter.
Wow.
So this particulate matter is horrible because it gets into lungs. It can increase chances for asthma, heart disease. There's some research that's linked it to increased chances of having diabetes. And in the nation, we're second in terms of a county in producing nitrogen oxide and volatile organic compounds, which themselves are bad for your health, but also are causative. They lead to chemistries that increase ground level ozone, which brings its own suite of health impacts. And so what you have is you have a landscape choice, which is damaging to human health, in a region that has never been in attainment for ozone. And then you add that on to Houston is extremely gifted from a biodiversity standpoint. We're one of only two what are called biodiversity hotspot cities in the U.S., us and L.A. But it's under great threat, that biodiversity. And there was a study that came out years ago that looked at lawns as habitat. And they compared lawns to junkyards in terms of habitat. And junkyards were 4 times more supportive of biodiversity than lawns. And so and then you look at other factors and lawns, because of the way they're managed, they're mowed in this area 30 to 50 times a year. So you're talking about a lot of air pollution. But every time you clip grass, you shorten the roots. And when you shorten the roots, there are fewer channels for the water to get down into the soil, and the soil gets hotter and harder. And so a lot of lawns, they have kind of a magic trick. They're kind of magicians. They look green and lush and oasis-like, but in a lot of cases, what they are is they're very hard and hotter than native vegetation. They don't soak up as much water, and they're pretty much dead zones for life.
Yeah.
And so they, it's not that I have just no lawn in my yard, but I think that the thing to think about is in areas where we don't need lawn, and there are massive stretches all over the city of gigantic multi-acre lawns that are maintained for no other reason but habit. Let's reforest those or put pocket prairies or wetlands that can capture water. Let's save some money over time. Let's improve the health of this place. And let's put in plants that actually show you where in the world you live in a city that's dominated by things like strip malls and other things, which kind of strip away sense of place, right? So,
I mean, that's Absolutely. Both, I think it's so fascinating, and it's one of the things that I love listening to you talk about is always a connection between our environment and our health, which I think folks are, very quick to think of, I don't want to be next to a Superfund site, right? I don't want to be next to an oil derrick. That we have a sense of, yeah, of course, if there's something really, seemingly toxic next to me, I understand that has a consequence on my health. But thinking about the amount of air pollution generated by mowing a lawn, which we were talking with Professor Tsang earlier about, the kind of idea of maintenance and often that folks kind of have a knee-jerk reaction to prairie, a native landscape that's going to involve a lot of maintenance, right? And kind of having to pause that and be like, well, it's not zero maintenance because no landscape is zero maintenance, but it's actually a lot lower than mowing your lawn 30 to 50 times, as you were saying, a year. And so that it's both this lower maintenance, but the way that also directly impacts our air quality. And I think that connection is just so powerful and palpable for us as we imagine these things. I know Sienna has a question that she wanted to ask you about some of what you were talking around in terms of resource management and urban development. So I'll pass over to Sienna to let you chat a little bit about how we're thinking of these things.
Yeah, so I was doing some research into the HOA laws around just in general in the U.S., and HOA is the Homeowners Association. So I know there's a lot of people that want to maybe change their conventional lawns, but they're being prevented from these HOA laws. So in general, what are some steps or practices that homeowners or communities can take to try to move away from these conventional lawns to more friendlier options?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the way I think about it is I've started to think of when I see landscaping choices on people's lots, I first of all, be non-judgmental. I mean, the truth is all Americans, since they were born, have been part of a large marketing campaign which has asserted that good neighbors, that's a moral qualifier, good neighbors maintain lawns and bad neighbors don't maintain lawns. So we've
This is
actually
white picket fence America,
that's
right?
right. we have created not just a physical landscape, but a moral landscape out of lawns, right? So let's be patient with people, first of all. The second thing I would say is start small and make it look intentional. So if you're going to start creating a climate-friendly instead of climate-damaging lawn, and lawns that are, I'm sorry, but yards that are all lawn are climate-damaging just because of all the emissions. So let's not think that they're neutral, because they're not. But if you want to have a climate-friendlier lawn, I would start small. I would make sure that anything that you put in looks like a garden bed, has a crisp, clean edge, is put into a garden bed that meets kind of some standards, whether that's a reforestation area in your yard or a prairie or both. I would also say that when we look at these HOA covenants, they can be very restrictive, obviously. In some places, they're not as restrictive. So check with your civic association or HOA to find out what's permissible or not. But back when Governor Perry was the governor of Texas a long time ago, it was a state bill that was signed by the governor. And what it did is it gave limited protection against HOAs for homeowners if those homeowners were planting zero-scaped plants, which means that if you're planting plants that help to conserve water, because Texas is going to have a number of water crises in the future, that they can't ding you for that. They can't enforce those parts of the covenant, right? So there is limited protection from the state of Texas. Most homeowners have no idea that that's there, and they don't know how to activate that. What I would say here in the Houston area is if you go to the Native Plant Society of Texas Houston chapter's website, there is information there about your rights as a homeowner in terms of native plants. The last thing I would say is make it social. And what I mean by that is I would explain to your neighbors before you do it, this is what we're going to do. And if you want to take it a step further and say, look, you want to help? We're going to put in this little pocket prairie or pollinator garden or a little reforested area. Want to come and help? Good example is my whole front yard near the Astrodome in a 1950s neighborhood is little pocket prairie during the spring. It's weird. Like you're passing lawn and lawn and lawn. These kids are walking forward. There's not a whole lot to see. Or the dogs are walking forward. There's not a whole lot to see. And then, whoop, they turn their head and they're like, what is that? It looks like there are butterflies all over the place and little avatar-like. And sometimes we'll actually have our neighbors come and stomp in some wildflower seeds. So it's not, oh, that crazy neighbor is doing something. It's, look what we have. And what I will tell you is during the pandemic, during those first very uncertain, very scary and stressful weeks that in March, we actually had school kids who couldn't go to school. They would come and sit on our curb and sketch the prairie and just watch the butterflies and the bees. We have this natural love, this biophilia of wild things. And when we allow ourselves the spaces to have that, we tap into that, and it's very meaningful.
I think that also gets us into a kind of broader question around, we do still have, some prairie preserves around Houston. There are some, natural landscapes that have been maintained, but they're often under threat. And so I'm wondering if you can talk, you brought up that kind of resource management approach, but as we think about the urban development of the city, as we think about how the city continues to grow, what are the things we should be considering in how we're allocating those resources, as I think you might be implying?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things, too. That's a great question. There are a number of things to think about here. One is, supporting groups that are saving land in Harris County and surrounding counties. And there are a number of land trusts. Land trusts save land. It's not just the Nature Conservancy. There are other great groups like Coastal Prairie Conservancy and Bayou Lane Conservancy and Galveston Bay Foundation. So support those local land trusts or a group like TNC so that they can go out and save the last best places in our area. That's important for a number of reasons. First of all, those are the arcs of biodiversity for the region. We don't want to lose those just for that reason. Secondly, those provide innumerable ecosystem services, anything from flood mitigation to urban heat island, reduction of urban heat island, to groundwater recharge, a whole bunch of things. But the third thing is really important when we're looking at suburban and urban landscapes, and that is what we need at this time is we need seeds and other plant resources that have evolved here for thousands of years and have seen all sorts of climatic conditions. So when we're doing it right, what we're doing is using some of these ancient old-growth prairies and older forests to harvest seeds to be used in the city and in suburbs to restore land. So at the Nature Conservancy, we've done it very intentionally. We have 4 local prairie preserves on the edges of the city, some in Brazoria County, some in Galveston County. Our team has harvested a lot of seeds, thousands of pounds of seeds for projects in Memorial Park, where they're reestablishing 50 acres of prairie, at the Jefferson Early Learning Center in Alief. And there's one prairie that is like my favorite prairie called the Nash Prairie Preserve, ancient old-growth prairie in Brazoria County.
Can you just say old growth? We hear this term a lot. What's the significance of an old-growth forest or prairie, just so listeners have an idea of why that matters?
Yeah, so I think that the term old growth, as applied to grasslands, is fairly new. So we have heard old-growth forest in relation to things like the redwood forest out in California and things for a long time. But a lot of times people look at what would look like just a field of flowers and things. They might think it's rather new. Some of these grasslands are hundreds or thousands of years old, as far as we can tell. So they've been there for a long time. They have a lot of muscle memory in terms of the climate and variability and flooding and fire and grazing and things like that. They're very tough. And so they tell us they're like a blueprint for how to rebuild these things, but they're also the seed source and the testing ground for how to do this stuff. So when I think of Houston in 2036, we can either continue on the course that we're on and create these very conventional spaces and more asphalt and more of all these things that make the city considerably hotter and less healthy and less spongy, or we can create a garden city that is resilient by design but doesn't look like it, right? And so in order to do that, we need these ancient places to provide guidance and wisdom and the seed sources and the other materials to get it done well.
And that goes back to these newer prairies that you're talking about. Exactly.
And we just had one last question. We wanted to know what was your favorite plant for creating a more environmentally friendly landscape? Like anything that you have in your own front yard?
I have lots of favorites.
I thought you might.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll give you a few. How about I'll give you a tree, a shrub, and a flower?
Bring it on.
Great.
Perfect.
There you go. As far as trees are concerned, oaks are prolific on this campus and all throughout the city. Oak trees provide lots of food for caterpillars. Caterpillars provide lots of food for birds. And so they're a great solid choice. Maple trees are a good solid choice as well. But I'll tell you one tree that people a lot of times just cut down because they call it a trash tree, which is awesome. It does drop limbs, but it's a powerhouse for wildlife. It's super incredibly tough. It laughs at concrete and it laughs at droughts and freezes. It's called sugar hackberry. It's growing in your neighborhood, whether you like it or not, because it's very popular with the birds. So totally underrated, the Rocky of trees, as it were. I would say in terms of getting started with a shrub, I'd probably go with Turk's cap. There is a medium-sized shrub that's a member of the hibiscus family, and it produces these beautiful scarlet red flowers that are wonderful for hummingbirds and butterflies. The fruit is also edible. It tastes like a cross between a watermelon and an apple.
Oh, wow.
And what it does is it reminds me every time we plant something native like this, or anytime I do any sort of grassland or forest restoration project in the city, it's also a reminder of the indigenous people that have been here for 13,000 years, right? So it's all of these, many of these plants have medicinal or edible, some ethnobotanical fiber thing that indigenous folks have here. So it's not just about like it tastes good or it feeds wildlife. It's a remembrance, right? It's an honoring. As far as flowers are concerned, I would say there are many species that you could select. I would select something like black-eyed Susan, which is easy to get. It is a great pollinator plant. Any of the sunflowers that are local will work. And there's just a bevy of wonderful coneflowers and other things. And if you just type in if you go to the Native Plant Society of Texas Houston chapter, you can see some of the nurseries that are selling those things and go grab some stuff. If you see a really great nursery is the Houston Audubon's nursery. They sell plants that are grown from locally collected seeds. So the genetics are right, the toughness is right, and you're also supporting a great conservation group. So I'd look at their website. A lot of times they're getting sold out now because there's so much demand, which is awesome. But there are other native growers in the area too.
Jaime Gonzalez, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great chatting with you.
I have been really excited to talk about this work, and I just can't thank you enough for having me on the show.
Great. Thanks, Jaime. And now we'll go over to our researcher, Jaden Bray-Boyce, who has an update on ways that you can get involved around town this week in Houston.
Hey y'all, I hope you're doing well. If you're looking for a fun way to get involved in the environment this week, look no further. On Tuesdays from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m., consider joining the Environmental Institute of Houston to be part of the Water Smart Habitat Volunteer Program on the University of Houston Clear Lake campus. Whether you're seeking community service hours or simply crave a change of pace, this environmental opportunity is for you. As a Water Smart Habitat volunteer, you'll play a pivotal role in maintaining the beauty and sustainability of the campus environment. Some of these tasks may include weeding and mulching flower beds, planting native plants, maintaining pathways, and trimming trees and bushes. The best part is, no experience is necessary. Never planted a flower or trimmed a tree before? No worries, you'll be guided every step of the way. If you're interested, all you need is a positive attitude, tools and gloves if you have. If not, no worries, those can be provided as well. Water, sunscreen, and a hat. Students, if you're looking for volunteer hours, someone there would be more than happy to sign off for you. You must be 18 years or older to participate. If the weather seems questionable, do not hesitate to call, as workdays are canceled due to inclement weather. Though a light sprinkle or drizzle will rarely prohibit gardening. If this opportunity excites you, feel free to call 281-283-3950. Again, that's 281-283-3950, or go to the website https:// www.uhcl.edu/environmental institute/outreach/get-involved for more information, as well as for directions. So with that, happy volunteering.
A quick reminder that if you're enjoying Gulf Streams, please check out our podcast. You can listen to previous episodes anytime on your favorite podcast app. We also feature occasional bonus content only available through the podcast, so make sure to subscribe so that you can keep up to date on all the news, stories, and ideas featured here on Gulf Streams. Up next time on Gulf Streams, we'll be talking about carbon capture and storage, what it is, how it's coming to Texas, and what risks might be carried in trying to put carbon back in the ground. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email me at westont@rice.edu. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski, co-produced by Joseph Campana, audio engineer Rico Enriquez, research support provided by Jaden Bray-Boyce and Sienna Yen. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.